and Sieber. To outline today's event, the webinar in its entirety will run approximately 1.5 hours, which includes a Q&A session. And if you have questions now or during the webinar, please enter those questions into the Q&A chat pod. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Our speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Eric Brodsky, Associate Director, Labeling Policy Team, Office of New Drug Policy in the Office of New Drugs in CDER. Please join me in welcoming our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Brodsky.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I would like also to welcome you to our webinar about the draft dosage and administration section of labeling guidance that was published in January 2023. We withdrew the previous dosage administration section of labeling guidance from 2010, and we have published the new draft in January, and primarily for two reasons. Number one, to account for the increased complexity of dosage and administration related information and labeling over the past decade, as well as the additional recommendations on how to include dosage and administration related information and labeling from nearly 20 guidances. Now here is my disclaimer. So objectives for day one. So this is part one of 2 webinars. At the end of this presentation, I'll discuss the objectives for day 2, tomorrow's presentation. Now sticking with day 1, I'll talk about the general principles for developing the dosage administration section of labeling, talk about recommended organization format, although there are no regulatory requirements about organization of the DNA section, the guidance talks about some items that generally should be included in the beginning of the section and some other items that potentially could be included later in the section. Next, we'll talk about critical dosage and administration related information. This is information where the lack of knowledge of this information or non-adherence to the information could have serious consequences for the patient. Next, we'll go on to the fundamental dosage administration information, specifically the starting dosage, how to titrate a dose, the maximum recommended dosage, potentially the maximum duration of the dosage. Next, we'll talk about specific recommendations about dosage in specific populations, such as patients with renal impairment, pediatric patients, geriatric patients, poor metabolizers, for example. And finally, we'll end today's discussion about the recommended dosage for fixed combination drug products and co-packaged products. So FDA sponsored a study of 70 physicians. There were 35 generalists and 35 specialists where we conducted about 45-minute interviews. And we asked these physicians what their preferences were for about the prescribing information, as well as containing or obtaining, I should say, drug information, and then also understanding the specific components of the prescribing information. And we asked them what sections of the 18 sections, if you include the box warning section, which of the 18 sections were the most useful to their clinical practice. Now, physicians were allowed to select more than one section. And here, I'm listing the most common sections that were most useful to healthcare practitioners. Here, in this study of 70 physicians, they rated the dosage administration section as the most useful to their practice. Thus, it's an important section of labeling. Here is the guidance, at least the picture of the first page of the guidance. The guidance, as I stated, was published in January. We are accepting comments to the guidance. So far, I have read all the comments. Thank you for the comments. And you're welcome again to submit additional comments. And we will look at all those comments and consider all those comments prior to finalization of the guidance. So the purpose of the dosage administration section of labeling guidance is to assist applicants in developing the dosage and administration related information in the dosage and administration section of labeling, and to ensure that this information contains the information needed for the safe and effective use of the drug. I should say in this guidance, we provide nearly 20 examples of dosage and or administration related information and labeling. About 10-15 years ago when we wrote labeling guidances, we had few examples. We have found that examples can be helpful not only to FDA staff as they review and develop labeling, as well as applicants. So the next set of slides will talk about the principles of developing the dosage administration section of labeling. So in this guidance, we define the term dose and dosage, and we recommend that you use the appropriate term in labeling as appropriate. So dose, we're referring to a specific amount of drug taken at one time, whereas dosage is more complex. It includes the dose, as well as the frequency, and potentially the duration. It's very important to present information in a clear and concise manner to potentially reduce the risk of medication errors. We recommend using active voice and command language. So instead of stating drug X treatment should be administered at a dose of 50 milligrams once daily, one can state administer 50 milligrams orally once daily, or potentially the recommended dosage is 50 milligrams orally once daily. Another principle of developing the DNA section of labeling guidance is using cross-references. Generally, we provide what to do in the DNA section of labeling, but why, the rationale, is generally in other sections of labeling. So one could use cross-references in the DNA section to reduce the amount of information, to make the information more clear and concise. Another concept is that the content in the DNA section is written for healthcare practitioners. It's not written for patients. So it has to be understandable for healthcare practitioners. And this hopefully will help reduce medication errors. In contrast, the patient instructions for use is written at the level of the patient, typically the National Reading Level, which is about a 6th grade reading level. So we write the DNA section for healthcare practitioners. In contrast, patient labeling is written at or below the National Reading Level. So with the DNA section of labeling, as well as all sections of labeling, when new information becomes available that causes the labeling to become inaccurate, false, or misleading, that information must be updated. We do say in this guidance that applicants should generally review Section 2, the dosage administration section, at least annually to make sure it contains accurate, up-to-date, clear information. We also state in the guidance, when the guidance is finalized, we recommend that you update the labeling when developing obviously a new drug, but also revising existing information for labeling for a currently approved drug. So this would be for not only new NDAs, new BLAs, but it also would be for efficacy supplements and labeling supplements. One important concept is dosing regimens must not be implied or suggested in other sections of labeling if they're not included in the DNA section. So one should not imply or suggest an unapproved dosage, for example, in Section 14, the clinical study section, if it's not recommended in Section 2. Similarly, in other sections of labeling, one should not imply an unapproved dosage regimen in the adverse reaction section or clinical pharmacology section or other sections of labeling. So in order to keep the dosage administration section very clear and concise, we recommend not including several pieces of information. So information that's not directly related to dosage, preparation, or administration of the product, or storage of a prepared product, like storage of a reconstituted solution or a diluted solution, all other information generally should not be included in the dosage administration section. However, it may be very appropriate to include that information in other sections of labeling. Now, the reason for this is that we do not want to distract or compete with the required and recommended information in the DNA section. And this is an important concept. I see this concept very frequently when I review labeling. We remove information or move information from section 2 to other sections of labeling. Generally, section 2 contains what to do, and the why, or the rationale for that, is in other sections of labeling. We recommend avoiding the term usual dosage or usual dose because those terms can refer to the most common dosage prescribed, the most common dose prescribed, which may not necessarily be the recommended dosage. So for PLR labeling, the regulations say recommended dose. So particularly when you're PLR converting labeling, you're converting labeling from old format, from the 1979 regulations and rule to PLR format, the 2006 rule and associated regulations, we must use the term recommended dose and recommended dosage. The guidance recommends avoiding the term interchangeable. I'm happy to report that we have approved 4 interchangeable biosimilar products, and we want to reserve the term interchangeable for those products that have been approved to be interchangeable biosimilar products. So when you could use other terms. So for example, instead of using the term interchangeable, you can use the term substitutable. Finally, on this slide, one should avoid efficacy data. Efficacy data is recommended to be included in section 14, the clinical study section. It's not included in section 2. So generally, the recommended approved dosage, which is stated in section 2, is typically the same as the dosage regimens studied in the clinical trials that are presented in the clinical study section of labeling. However, there may be some differences. Frequently, in phase 2, there are different dose regimens studied, and many of them are not approved and not recommended. So it is a different concept. So we avoid, right here, there's a description of the dosages used in this study. So if this was the recommended dosage, we would potentially say, instead of in controlled trials of drug X and disease Y, dosages in the range of 1 milligram to 10 milligrams once daily were administered, we would state the recommended dosage for disease Y is 1 milligram to 10 milligrams orally once daily. Additionally, we recommend not including the USP descriptor next to the subject drug. Although the USP descriptor can be included in other sections of labeling, particularly the product quality sections of labeling, like sections 3, 11, 16. Dosage forms and strengths, description, how supplied, and storage and handling, respectively. Generally, we do not include how supplied information in section 2. How supplied information must be in section 16, how supplied storage and handling section, and may be in section 3, dosage forms and strengths section of labeling, section 3. So package type terms, identifying characteristics of the dosage form, that information goes in sections 3 and 16, not in section 2. An example here information about the package type term without preservatives, that doesn't go in section 2. There's an exception to this, and we'll talk about that when we talked about co-packaged products. Next, generally we recommend using the metric system, not the British imperial system. We don't recommend using pounds. We recommend using kilograms. Additionally, we recommend using milliliters instead of teaspoons. We've actually noted that there have been some medication errors associated with using pounds and kilograms. That's another reason to only use the metric system, not both systems when presenting the dosage in the DNA section. Also, we avoid abbreviations or signals or other dose designations that could potentially lead to medication errors. For example, instead of saying QD, use the term once daily. And I will refer you to the Institute for Safe Medication Practices list of potential problematic terms, symbols, abbreviations that could lead to medication errors. However, there are certain situations which we want to use symbols, for example, and I presented some there. And these are situations when there's a low risk or minimal risk of medication errors. And when we spell out the terms, it could make the information more difficult to understand. So instead of stating ALT greater than 3 times the upper limit of normal to less than or equal to ALT 5 times the upper limit of normal, you can state the phrase in green. Now, we're talking about liver enzyme abnormalities, potentially for dose modifications. That would be a situation where it may come up. So let's move now to organization format of the dosage administration section of labeling. Now, there is no specific requirement in the DNA section of labeling regulations about how information should be organized. However, I'll show you some general concepts, recommendations about how to organize this section of labeling. Generally, as with all sections, information is ordered based upon relative clinical importance. The most important information is in the beginning of the section, and less important information later in the section. Occasionally, not common, we have an overview section, a dosage and administration overview section, subsection. And I'll talk about an example later, give you an example of this. Generally, if you have that, that would be the first subsection. Next, if you have critical information for the safe and effective use of the drug, this is situations where non-adherence to this can lead to potentially medication errors or patient harm. That would be first if you don't have a dosage overview section. Next is really the fundamental dosage administration related information. So that is the recommended starting dosage, the titration, the maximum recommended dosage, whether you had a loading dose, as well as the administration information that is presented with the dosage information, such as the routes of administration. Other types of information, let's say storage of the reconstituted product, how to prepare a product that comes as a lyophilized powder, that is towards the latter part of the dosage administration section. This is an example of organizing information in the dosage administration section of labeling. Here, important pre-medication potential, let's say, to reduce the risk of hypersensitivity reactions. This is what you need to do before administering the drug. That is critical information that is presented first, at least with this subject drug is labeling. Next, we include the fundamental dosage information. So there's different recommended dosages in disease A and B. Next, we have a specific recommended dosage in patients with renal impairment. Later on, we have dosage modifications due to drug interactions, potentially less important information compared to the items I presented above would be preparation, administration instructions, and storage of the diluted product. Here's another example of an organization scheme for the dosage administration section for the subject drug. And again, labeling is developed for the subject drug. And so this organization scheme fits this subject drug. In subsection 2.1, we have important tests, evaluation prior to using the drug. Again, before you use the drug, this is what we should do. Although typically administration instructions are given, presented next to the recommended dosage, if they're important administration instructions, for example, do not use intrathecally because there are medication errors with intrathecal use, that is something you may want to include before the fundamental dosage and administration section. Subsections 2.3 and 2.4 are the fundamental dosage information for adults and certain pediatric patients. And then later on, we have dosage modifications for adverse reactions and for a specific class of drugs. Dosage modifications for a specific class of drugs. So subsections. So subsections could be very helpful to improve organization in the DNA section of labeling. Subsections are not required, but they can be very helpful. Generally, we recommend if the recommended dosage is the same in across indications or across subpopulations, we recommend it contained in one subsection of labeling, of the DNA section of labeling, I should say. Another recommendation, and this is not just for the DNA section, but generally all throughout labeling, we generally do not recommend including information between the section heading and the first subsection. And we call this information floating information. Now, why do we make this recommendation? Well, if you're looking at structured product labeling, for example, electronic labeling, and you click on subsection 2.1 in the table of contents, what will be at the top of the page, what will appear is 2.1 recommended dosage. And you will quote, miss, unquote, the information that's floating between section 2 and subsection 2.1. So the recommendation is to take the floating information and incorporate it within one or more of the subsections below. If there's something, for example, administration with respect to food that's relevant to many subsections, you could create an additional subsection about administration instructions that's applicable to all of the dosage for all the subpopulations and all the indications. Another concept is differentiating the subsection titles in the indications of usage section and the dosage administration section. If you look at the left side of this table, sometimes we see that the subsection titles in, like, for example, subsection 1.1 and subsection 2.1 are the same. And it may be more difficult for healthcare practitioners to distinguish between the indication for condition A and the recommended dosage for condition A. And one way to address this is to state, for example, the recommended dosage for condition A in subsection 2.1 versus subsection 1.1 will include the term condition A. So when you have complex dosage and or administration related information, we recommend organizing information potentially in tables, figures, bulleted lists, or algorithms. So for example, if you have a complicated recommended dosage in patients with renal impairment compared to those with normal renal function, a table can be useful. Algorithms may be important to include if you adjust the dosage based upon ideal body weight or adjusted body weight. Sometimes I see tables in section 2, the dosage administration section, without an introduction. So a table is there, but there's no introduction. So generally, we recommend in the text an introduction to the table or figure. So this is an example. See Table Y for the recommended dosage in pediatric patients aged 12 years and older with renal impairment. This is an example of a table where this is a titration schedule, and we refer to Table 1 in the text. So this example actually provides two organizational techniques. One is a bulleted list to differentiate the recommended dosage based upon weight. And the second item is including a formula. The formula is basically for the adjusted body weight, which only occurs in the higher weight patients. The lower weight patients, it's actual body weight. For the higher weight patients, it's based upon adjusted body weight, and the formula is provided. So as I stated earlier, uncommonly, we have a dosage overview subsection. If you do have one, that is the first subsection in the dosage administration section. This is an example of a drug approved for bowel preparation for colonoscopy. This is a product that has two different dosing regimens according to age groups. So adults get a higher strength A, and pediatric patients, adolescents, get strength B. With this particular product, there was concerns about medication errors, particularly the pediatric patients getting the higher strength and having a potentially greater strength, leading to more adverse reactions. So to differentiate the dosing regimens in adults and pediatric patients and to make it more prominent, we included a dosage administration overview subsection. Note some of the details about dosage administration are in the subsequent subsections. So for example, for the adults, you go see subsection 2.3, and for pediatric patients to adolescents, you go to dosage administration subsection 2.4. Additionally, with these products, there are different amounts of water for dilution that's required. That detailed information that are provided in the different subsections, subsection 2.3 and subsection 2.4. So if you have a product that is potentially associated with a risk of medication errors, and one way to distinguish information and to make it more prominent is to have an overview subsection, although this, again, is rather uncommon. So critical dosage or administration-related information, generally this appears before the fundamental dosage information. So examples are, let's say there's medication errors that have occurred and resulted in serious adverse reactions. So for example, if someone is using the incorrect route of administration, you want to warn people not to use that route of administration. The why, the reason for that is in other sections of labeling. Let's say the warnings and precautions section of labeling, the details. But the recommendation not to use that route of administration is summarized briefly in the DNA section in a very prominent manner. If the dosage form needs to be diluted prior to administration, for example, if you give the undiluted product, that may result in toxicity. This is important information to know. The details about how to dilute the product may be in the latter sections, but the need to dilute the product may be in the beginning of the DNA section of labeling. Let's say you have a product where substitution of one product for another may lead to clinically significant adverse reactions or loss of effectiveness. This may be very important to say early. A classic example is a liposomal product that you want to state that drugazide liposome injection is not substitutable for drugazide injection. Other situations are that you may not have substitution on a milligram per milligram basis. This is important information that is generally appears before the fundamental dosage information. Let's say you have infusion rates that have been associated with clinical significant adverse reactions above the maximum recommended infusion rate. You want to say something like the maximum recommended infusion rate is X milligrams per hour. Avoid infusion rates greater than X milligrams per hour. And here we'll refer to the warnings and precautions section for the detailed consequences of inappropriate or maybe inadvertent infusion rates greater than the maximum recommended dosage. So the details are in the warnings and precautions section. Additional critical dosage or administration related information. If you must administer a drug in a specific healthcare setting, let's say a hospital or by a specific user, we had a good public comment about revising the guidance to also include a preparation that may be required or recommended in a specific healthcare setting, and totally agree with that about updating the final guidance with that recommendation as well. For example, pharmacy bulk packages must be prepared under a specific healthcare practitioner setting. That's a very good point. So if there are tests, evaluations, or procedures that are needed or required to be done prior to dosing, that would be very important to say. So for example, let's say the drug is associated with embryo-fetal toxicity. You may want it to include information about testing females' reproductive potential, pregnancy testing, or at least verifying that tests were done prior to prescribing the drug. On the slides, I give an example of evaluating testing immunosuppressive drug that's associated with serious infections, such as tuberculosis. So in this example, in the beginning of the DNA section, we would include information about evaluating and testing prior to initiating the drug. This is for active tuberculosis and testing for latent tuberculosis. Here is another fictitious example about testing prior to drug initiation. This is a product, actually, like the example I said earlier, associated with embryo-fetal toxicity. This product is also associated with elevated transaminase levels. And prior to initiating drug, we want to verify the pregnancy status, and we also want to obtain some baseline transaminase levels. Potentially, if they're too high, we will not initiate the drug. So now we'll turn our attention to fundamental dosage or administration-related information in labeling. So this is what we classically think as the recommended dosage. So this term includes the dosage range, if relevant, how we start the dose, is there a loading dose or loading dosage, how do we titrate the drug to ensure that we reduce the risk of adverse reactions and then achieve maximum effectiveness, what's the maximum recommended dosage. For some drugs, there's a maximum recommended duration. As part of the recommended dosage, it may be weight-based or maybe body surface area-based. Is it adjusted by the ideal body weight, adjusted body weight, and then do we include a formula for calculating the dose? Additionally, for some drugs, therapeutic drug monitoring. Along with the recommended dosage, we recommend including, next to the recommended dosage, certain administration instructions, let's say routes of administration. Additionally, if a product needs to be taken with food substances or food, including information about how to take that product with food or food substances. So here's an example of a recommended loading dose. This is a product that is administered for maintenance dosing subcutaneously. The loading dose is an intravenous infusion, and then subsequently after the intravenous infusion, after the loading dose, one starts the maintenance dose subcutaneously. This is an example of a titration schedule. And when we present the titration schedule, we want to present how we increase the dose increments. And in the example, I highlighted that in blue, as well as how often we can increase the dose and the timing of doing that. And that's represented in green. So for the maximum recommended duration, generally we do not restrict the duration of chronically administered drugs for chronic diseases or conditions. Generally, we include the duration of the studies that supported the effectiveness of the product in Section 14 in the clinical studies section of labeling, and we're careful not to include the duration when we're not restricting duration in Section 2. We do not want to unnecessarily restrict duration. However, there are some situations where we would restrict the duration of the drug, and sometimes it's the nature of the condition. The condition is self-limiting, let's say an acute musculoskeletal disorder, or maybe we only use the drug short-term to treat a disease, let's say an antibacterial product to treat uncomplicated urinary tract infection, or let's say bronchitis. That duration of use is going to be shorter. Another example would be if we have a reasonable concern about the safety of the drug with longer-term use. So for this example, this is a drug, this fictitious drug causes increased bone loss with increased duration of use. And this may not be reversible on discontinuation. The description of the bone loss is included in the warnings and precautions section. And in Section 2, we provide the maximum recommended duration, along with the maximum recommended dosage, the route of administration, and how to use it with food. This is actually with or without food. But the maximum recommended duration of use is provided in Section 2 under this circumstance when we have a reasonable concern about the safety of the drug with longer-term use. So recommended dosage in specific populations. So in the guidance, we use different terminology. So when we have a different recommended dosage, let's say patients with hepatic impairment compared to patients with normal hepatic function, or pediatric patients compared to adult patients, or patients with renal impairment compared to patients with normal renal function, it's a recommended dosage. Essentially, most people with chronic renal impairment have had chronic renal impairment for a long time, whether due to type 2 diabetes or hypertension. We're not changing. They start out at a different dosage, and they remain on a different dosage. We're not modifying the dosage with that particular patient. In contrast, dose modifications due to adverse reactions, we are modifying the dose. So we may start out with 100 milligrams once daily. There's an adverse reaction, and we may lower the dose. That's a dose modifications. Similarly, we use the term dose modifications in the context of drug interactions. If we're modifying the dose, if we add a drug, we may modify that dose, increase the dose, lower the dose, change the dose with respect to timing of administration of the two drugs together. So we use different terminology. Recommended dosage in patients with renal impairment compared to dose modifications due to adverse reactions, and dose modifications due to drug interactions. So the recommended dosage in pediatric patients were required to include the recommended dosage in all pediatric patients for all approved pediatric indications. We're required to do that in the DNA section. And there are differences in dosage amongst pediatric patients. Let's say younger pediatric patients, neonates, infants, younger children compared to adolescents. We're also required to include the different dosages among the pediatric populations. One concept that we have about pediatric use information is to ensure consistent information about pediatric use information. And the three parts of labeling that we typically look at is sections 1, sections 2, and subsection 8.4. In this fictitious example, I'm starting out with subsection 8.4. So in this product, the safety and effectiveness of the drug for a specific indication have been established in adolescents, pediatric patients 12 years of age and older. However, if you look at sections 1 and 2, it's not totally clear, and information about the approved age groups seems inconsistent. So section 1, it appears that the drugs are approved for all patients, adult patients and all pediatric patients, patients less than 12 years of age. And looking at section 2, it also appears that there's no age groups mentioned, so it also appears that's approved for all age groups. So there's some inconsistency here. So we recommend when you develop pediatric use information looking at sections 1, section 2, and subsection 8.4. And let's say with this drug, it's approved for adults and pediatric patients greater than 12 years in age and older. So you look at sections 1, subsection 8.4, that's consistent. And also in section 2, we're providing the recommended dosage in adults as well as adolescents. And we're being intentional and we're being very clear about the approved age groups. So recommended dosage in patients who are 65 years of age and older. And with respect to labeling, we define geriatric patients as patients those 65 years of age and older. If there is a different recommended dosage in geriatric patients compared to younger adult patients, it must be included in section 2. Additionally, we do have a few approved products that are only approved in geriatric patients. For example, there are certain flu vaccines only approved in geriatric patients, not in younger adult patients. And in those situations, we must include the recommended dosage in those geriatric patients in section 2 as well. So here's an example about adding recommended dosage in geriatric patients. In this first part of the example, I'm showing the recommended dosage in adults less than 65 years of age. And we have two different dosage regimens for disease A and disease B. We also have a different dosage recommendation for geriatric patients according to disease A and disease B. Notice we use the term in adults less than 65 years of age to differentiate it from that subsection 2.1, to differentiate it from the recommendations regarding dose in geriatric patients in subsection 2.2. So recommended dosage in patients with renal impairment. So we must include the dosage in patients in a specific renal impairment subpopulation if it's different than patients with normal kidney function. We must include that in section 2. This is a new concept, the second bullet here. So if there are differences in dosages for at least one of the renal impairment subpopulations, let's say patients with moderate renal impairment compared to those with normal renal function, we recommend including information about how to use the drug in all renal impairment subpopulations. So that would include if there are differences in dosages or potentially if use is inadvisable. So this is an exception to what we talked about earlier. Generally, we do not include contraindications in section 2. We do not include statements about avoiding use or not recommended generally in specific populations. However, if we're providing the dosage recommendation in one renal impairment subpopulation, and use is inadvisable in another renal impairment subpopulation, we should provide that information for a complete picture. If we only provided, let's say, a dosage recommendations in patients with moderate renal impairment, healthcare practitioners may wonder, well, what happens to my patients with severe renal impairment and patients with mild renal impairment? How do I dose them? Are there any differences? So we provide a complete picture. So this is an example of providing recommended dosage in the DNA section for patients with renal impairment. Now let me take you through this example. As I stated earlier, if there's complex dosage information, one could use a table. So this table is used nicely to present this complex information. I should note the GFR bands, the estimated GFR bands that are included in the first column are not based upon any renal impairment classification scheme. It's based upon the data. So for example, in this fictitious example, we may have seen if you go below 49 milliliters per minute, you get much higher exposure of the drug compared to patients with an estimated GFR greater than 50. So it's based upon the data determines the bands. If you are providing information, again, as I stated earlier, on one renal impairment subpopulation, you provide it on all renal impairment subpopulations. So in this example, the recommended dosage for patients with normal renal function is 2 grams every 8 hours. So notice for those with a band of 50 to 89 milliliters per minute, it's the same dosage as those with normal renal function. But here we're being very intentional by including that so patients know what to do in all renal impairment subpopulations. If a product is given around dialysis, one should specify the type of dialysis, right? So is it peritoneal dialysis? Is it CRRT, continuous renal replacement therapy? Is it intermittent hemodialysis? And if we have recommendations with respect to administering around dialysis, provide information about the timing of administering the drug. So the last line, the 2 asterisk bullets, provides that information. Administer drug X after dialysis. This is after intermittent hemodialysis. Finally, if you look at the first bullet, this is a method to convert estimated GFR that is standardized to body surface area, so 1.73 meters squared, to estimated GFR that is not standardized to body surface area. And that's a footnote that's a conversion factor in the first bullet of this example. So this is another example about including recommended dosage in patients with renal impairment. This is for specific pediatric patients. And in this example, as I stated earlier, one could use a table for complex information. Similarly to the other example, these eGFR bands are based upon the data, although this example lines up more nicely with typically what we think of, let's say, mild renal impairment, moderate renal impairment, severe renal impairment. But this is not based upon a scheme, a renal impairment scheme. It's based upon the data. I should note that in the last row, there is actually no dosage recommendations. The use is not recommended. As I stated earlier, if you provide a recommended dosage in one renal impairment population, we should provide a usage statement about all renal impairment subpopulations, even if the use is inadvisable, like the use is not recommended, for a complete picture of dosing or lack of dosing in all renal impairment populations. So this is an exception to what we were talking about before, about avoiding generally information that's inadvisable in the DNA section with respect to dosing. Now let's look at the first footnote. So in pediatric patients, we don't use the same equations as in adult patients. So we included the bullet estimate GFR using an equation validated for use in the appropriate pediatric age group. And that's why we include that statement. So for example, the Cockcroft-Gault is not specifically for pediatric patients. It's for adults. So this, similar to renal impairment patients, we must provide information about dosage in hepatic impairment patients if the dosage is different than patients with normal hepatic function. Similar to the renal concept, if we provide a dosage recommendation for one subpopulation of patients with hepatic impairment, we should provide information about its use in all hepatic impairment subpopulations. And now, again, this is a different concept than before. This is to ensure we have a complete picture. When we're providing the recommended dosage in patients with hepatic impairment, it's slightly different than renal impairment, that the recommendation is to identify the method used for classifying hepatic function, and typically this is the Child-Pugh classification, class A, B, and C. And so this is an example. Subsection 2.1 provides the recommended dosage in patients. And then we also have another subsection about specific recommended dosage in patients with hepatic impairment. The item in green, you can notice that this provides dosage recommendations in patients with moderate hepatic impairment, which is different. It's lower, 25 milligrams once daily. It's lower than patients with normal hepatic function. But additionally, we include the recommended dosage in patients with mild hepatic impairment, which is the same as those with normal hepatic function, but we do this for completeness. And additionally, in blue, we provide information about use of the drug in severe hepatic impairment. We're recommending avoiding use. Again, so we talk about usage in severe, avoid use, dosage in moderate, it's a lower dosage, and also dosage in mild, which is the same dosage, a complete picture. Additionally, we may provide, recommend, if appropriate, if there are differences in the recommended dosage in other populations, we must provide that. We actually do have a few examples of dosage being different in females versus males, and we must provide that if there is a difference in Section 2. If there are differences in doses based upon genetic characteristics, let's say patients who are CYP2D6 poor metabolizers compared to those that are normal metabolizers, this must be included in Section 2. Additionally, there may be differences in dosage in postpartum patients, pregnant patients versus patients who are not pregnant, differences due to dosage in racial and or ethnic subgroups being Hispanic Latino versus not Hispanic Latino, or potentially other groups. Note, this is not an exhaustive list. There may be other differences in dosage in specific populations. Now, moving on to the last topic for today's presentation is the recommended dosage for fixed combination drug products and for co-packaged products. So we defined fixed combination drug products in this guidance and several other guidances as a drug in which two or more active ingredients are combined at a fixed dosage in a single dosage form. Again, it's a single dosage form. And very importantly, not just to identify the dosage form, but to identify the recommended dose or dosage of each component, each drug and or biological component, and that fixed combination drug products. So here is the example. Right here, we include not only just one tablet orally once daily. What's in that tablet? We have 500 milligrams of active ingredient A, 250 milligrams of active ingredient B, and 100 milligrams of active ingredient C. Important to provide the dosage for each of the components of a fixed combination drug product. This is another example of a fixed combination drug product labeling. We provide the dosage for each of the active ingredients here, active ingredient A and active ingredient B. And the second example for this slide, similarly, here we're taking one packet, but we identify the dosage for each of the ingredients. Now for co-packaged products, so for the purposes of this guidance, we define co-packaged product. It's a drug product that contains 2 or more separate drugs. They could be 2 drugs, 2 biological products, could be 1 drug and 1 biological product. And they are intended to be used together, and they're contained in a single package or unit. So again, they're 2 separate drugs, and they're packaged together, used for the same indication. In this situation, similar to fixed combination drug products, we recommend including the recommended dosage for each drug that is co-packaged. As I stated earlier, we don't generally include house supplied information in Section 2, like identifying characteristics that is required in Sections 3 and 16, but this is the difference. So to differentiate, sometimes I should say to differentiate the products, let's say you have 2 tablets or 2 capsules. One can't just say take capsule because you're not sure which capsule you're talking about. So in some of these situations, it may be important to identify the characteristics of the drug, of the dosage form. So this is the example. We explain to people right away, very important to be upfront. It's a co-packaged product that contains active ingredient A tablets, that's one unit, and a separate product, and active ingredient B tablets. And we say the recommended oral dosage of drug X is the following. Note, we include the identifying characteristics, square blue tablet versus a round yellow tablet. And we also include the active ingredients that are being administered. This is to be very clear what the product is and what dosage is being administered. So, challenge questions. So, challenge question number 1. What information should be retained or removed? And I'll give you a couple seconds to look at this. What information should be retained in this fictitious DNA section, subsection I should say, and what information should be removed? So in this situation, we are going to remove the details of adverse reactions. That information must be in Section 6, the adverse reactions section, and potentially in the warnings and precautions section. That has nothing to do with dosage or administration related information. However, the last part about that talks about pre-medication, and that should be included in Section 2. So we retitled it to recommended pre-medication prior to dosing, and we maintained that sentence. Challenge question 2, similarly, what information should be retained or removed in this subsection? In this example, we're removing information about the study dose. We talked earlier about the study dose may be the same as the recommended dosage, at least the study doses that's presented in the clinical study section, but it may not. And here, we're presenting the recommended dosage instead of what the study dosage was. Again, recommended dosage in Section 2, study dose described in the trials in the clinical study section of labeling. Challenge question 3. I'll read the question. What information generally must or should be included in the DNA section of physician labeling? So the correct answer is the route or routes of administration. As I stated earlier, number A, generally we don't include house supplied information. Is the previous example showed doses studied in phase 3 clinical studies. That information is generally in section 14, not in section 2. The usual dose is not a term that is used in PLR labeling. We use the term recommended dosage because the usual dosage may not be the recommended dosage. Usual dosage may be the most commonly prescribed dosage. And E is incorrect. Generally, if everything's inadvisable to use in patients with mild, moderate, and severe renal impairment, that would not go in section 2. It's only when you have a different recommended dosage in one of the subpopulations compared to the other subpopulations. Now, it is important to include renal impairment information in labeling, and this information may be important to include in section 8 under the use in specific population section or potentially a warnings and precautions section, but generally not in section 2 if there's no dosage recommendation in a specific renal impairment subpopulation. Now, this is the final question, challenge question. When providing the recommended dosage in patients with renal impairment in the DNA section. So answer C is correct. As I stated earlier, if a drug can be administered in patients who receive dialysis, first of all, provide the dialysis modality, and then also provide the timing of administering the drug in relationship to dialysis. With respect to A, as I stated earlier, we want a complete picture. If there is a different recommended dosage in one renal impairment subpopulation, we want to talk about all of the renal impairment subpopulations. In number 2, we generally prefer using the term recommended dosage in patients with renal impairment rather than dosage adjustment in patients with renal impairment, because patients with renal impairment, generally chronic renal impairment, the next day they're not going to have normal renal function if they have chronic renal impairment. You're not adjusting the dosage with them. That's their starting recommended dosage. So learning objectives for tomorrow, this is what's up for tomorrow. We're going to be talking about administration instructions that are included with the recommended dosage, monitoring for effectiveness, other therapy that's used before the subject drug, and concomitant therapy, dosage modifications due to adverse reactions and drug interactions. Also tomorrow, we're going to talk about recommendations for drug discontinuation. This is for a product that's associated with a discontinuation syndrome on abrupt withdrawal. We'll talk about specific preparation instructions, let's say for a lyophilized powder or a product that needs to be diluted. We'll also talk about preparation and administration instructions for other products and storage instructions for the prepared product. That's for tomorrow. Great. Now it's time for the question and answering session for webinar part 1 today. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentation, Dr. Brodsky. And we'll now transition into our Q&A session. As a reminder, if you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. It looks like we have some questions coming in right now, and here is the first question for Dr. Brodsky. If using the recommended dose of drug X, does it suggest that other dosage could be used for drug X and therefore cause confusion?
Good question. I think this question relates to the terminology we use in the dosage and administration section of labeling. So we use the term recommended dose or dosage, that's for several reasons. Number one, it follows our regulations. The term recommended dose is used. It doesn't say recommended approved dose. And number two, the prescribing information is to communicate the essential information needed to use the drug safely and effectively to the healthcare practitioner. So again, the audience is healthcare practitioners, and therefore, we use the term recommended dosage or recommended dose. Healthcare practitioners can use the drug as they see fit. However, if someone asks us what is the approved dosage, we'll provide them we can use the term approved dosage. But in the healthcare practitioner setting, if that's the audience, we use the term recommended dose or recommended dosage. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions coming in, and here is the next question. Can you clarify what you mean by the USP descriptor?
Good question. This is in reference to one of the earlier slides when I stated that the USP descriptor, the recommendation is to not include that descriptor USP after non-proprietary name of a product within the dosage administration section of labeling, specifically the specific drug. So USP stands for the United States Pharmacopoeia, and for drug products that are not biological products, when there is a USP monograph, so the drug has to follow the nomenclature, has to follow that name according to USP, and has to follow the specific monograph, applicants may include the USP descriptor, USP, after the non-proprietary name of the drug, which is typically drug route administration dosage form, or it could be drug dosage form. So after that terminology, the non-proprietary name, applicants may choose to include the USP descriptor. Generally, if applicants want to do this next to the subject drug, we recommend including this in the product quality related sections of the labeling, sections 3, 11, 16, not in section 2, to avoid distracting from or competing with required and recommended information in labeling. Thank you.
Thanks for clarifying on that question, Dr. Brodsky. And moving on, we've got a few more questions that are just arriving. Here's the next question. If there are multiple dosage forms available for a product, where should recommendations for who each dosage form should be used for be integrated in the dosage administration section?
Good question. So dosage form information is required in 5 sections of the prescribing information. 2 places in the highlights of prescribing information and 3 places in the full prescribing information. So with respect to the highlights, it's required in the product title and the dosage forms and strengths heading and highlights. And in the full prescribing information, it's required in section 3, dosage forms and strengths section, section 11, description section, and section 16, house supplied storage and handling section. The dosage form is not required in section 2 in the dosage administration section. And generally, if one doesn't need to mention the dosage form, it doesn't need to be there. So let's say, for example, as the question states, there are two, or let's say there are 2 dosage forms. One is a tablet, one are tablets, another one is capsules. And you could use either one. And obviously, there's no preparation instructions. You could say the recommended dosage is 10 milligrams orally once daily. And if the capsules and tablets have the same strength, there's no need to mention that in section 2 to avoid, again, distracting, repeating with required and recommended information labeling, specifically in the DNA section. However, if there are different recommended dosage according to dosage forms, like for example, if tablets is recommended in adults and adolescents, but a 4-oral solution is recommended in neonates or or other younger pediatric patients, then you would want to specify for pediatric patients aged 2 to 7, use the 4-oral solution dosage form, and the recommended dosage is. So you would want to specify it if it's different for the subpopulation. You may also have different preparation instructions. So, for example, maybe you have a lyophilized powder that is reconstituted, so it's a 4 injection dosage form, and would want to provide the preparation instructions for that dosage form. In contrast, let's say the other dosage form is extended release tablets and there's no preparation instructions, you would not provide that information in the DNA section. So really, you may not need to include dosage form information, number one. And number two, if it should be included, you would provide that in the places where it's recommended. So potentially within the recommended dosage, if it's a different dosage for according to dosage form by subpopulation, or within the preparation instructions if it's applicable there. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question, Dr. Brodsky. We do have a few more coming in, and here's the next question. When dosing for a product is based on milligram per kilogram or milligram per meter squared, what is the recommendation for wording of dose modifications such as a reduction of drug X? Should it be stated as fractions, percentages? Is there a most preferred approach to minimize medication errors?
Good question. Obviously, in this example and other examples, sometimes it's drug specific and it depends upon the information submitted in the application. Generally, we recommend to be as specific as possible. So if the recommended dosage is 10 milligrams per kilogram for indication A in adults, and the dosage modifications due to for drug interaction, we would recommend being more specific, like saying with concomitant use with drug B, the um, decrease the dosage to 5 milligrams per kilogram. So more specificity is better to reduce the risk of medication errors. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Here is the next question. Do you have any recommendations or examples of dosage and administration text which includes down titration?
Good question. Actually, we have some really good examples tomorrow. So, for example, if you have a product associated with a withdrawal syndrome with abrupt discontinuation, so let's say it's an opioid, a benzodiazepine, a SNRI, a beta blocker, you would provide information about the discontinuation syndrome in the dependence subsection of section 9, drug abuse and dependence section, and you would include specific tapering recommendations in section 2, how to taper the drug to off, which would include a down titration. Other examples would be dosage modifications due to adverse reactions. For example, um, if you have data that support um, dosage modifications due to adverse reactions, you may provide specificity. If adverse reaction A occurred once, you down titrate to this level, and if it occurs a second time, you down titrate again. So there's some examples in tomorrow's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brodsky, for overviewing tomorrow's presentation a little bit and inviting everyone back. And we do have more questions coming in. And here's the next question. Rather than 2.1 dosage and administration overview, can it be titled recommended dosage?
Yes, yes. And the guidance also states that there's definitely flexibility about using titles in the DNA section of labeling. with respect to titles of subsections or headings under subsection. And in that specific example, you could retitle it to recommended dosage and administration. I think it had some administration components. In this specific example that I was referring to, there was there's a concern about medication errors with using one um, one dosage schedule versus another dosage schedule, and there was a lot of details about each of the dosage schedules. So in this case, to potentially reduce the risk of medication errors and to highlight the two dosing regimens, a dosage overview subsection was created. And under subsections, I think it was 2.3 and 2.4, there's a lot of information about how to dose and how to use concomitant water for the bowel prep. But let's say there's less information, you could all include it under a recommended dosage administration subsection. That's correct.
Thank you for responding to that question. And here's the next question. If testing is required before use, for example, for the target of an antibody therapy, should that be in section 2, 2.1, prior to pre-medications 2.2, or should it be in section 1 after the indication?
Good question. So this question is in respect to patient selection. So for example, if you have a drug approved for a certain tumor, um, in only patients with a certain genotype, and you needed to do testing, let's say companion diagnostic testing for patient selection, that information would be included in section 1 and also section 2. Typically, we use the term patient selection as the first subsection in section 2, patient selection, and that provides a little bit more details about how to obtain more information about the companion diagnostic device. Specifically, there's a reference to an FDA website within CDER. That's to our companion diagnostic website. So because that is somewhat part of the approved indication, that would be subsection 2.1. And then later, for example, you would have subsection 2.2 pre-medications as noted here. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have more questions coming in, Dr. Brodsky, and here's the next question. For fundamental dosage slide 28, is that the recommended order for the information to appear?
So going back to slide 28, I would say generally, so again, it depends upon the specifics of that drug's dosage preparation and administration. So this typically one would include the recommended starting dosage first, how to titrate the dosage, the target dosage, and then the maximum recommended dosage, and if applicable, the maximum recommended duration. Typically, that's how it's done, ordering it from the start, how you would start the drug, to how to titrate up, to the target dose, to the maximum dosage. So the weight-based dosage or body surface area dosage is part of the recommended dosage. Same thing with dosing range or dosage range. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got another question, Dr. Brodsky, and here's the question. Can you please address when management of severe adverse reactions should be included in the dosage and administration section?
That's a good question. So generally, if you have data that supports dosage modifications or administration modifications, typically this is done in clinical trials where if there's a certain adverse reaction, there's a change in dose, reduce the dose, and then if it's very severe, you discontinue the dose. So typically it follows the clinical trial. If there are some recommendations about, so detailed descriptions of the clinically significant adverse reactions or just adverse reactions, um, That information doesn't belong in Section 2. It belongs in Section 6 and potentially Section 5, warnings and precautions section. Management information, mitigation strategies, monitoring, reducing the risks of adverse reactions. If it doesn't involve dosage, modification of dosage, it generally doesn't belong in the DNA section of labeling. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. And here's a question regarding colors and the use of on slide 30. Regarding the colors used on slide 30, dose escalation, is there a recommendation to use color in the label?
Good question, Ray. So I was using color to emphasize certain elements of that example. And generally, we don't recommend using color in the prescribing information because it potentially could distract from or compete with the required and recommended information in labeling. So sometimes we use bolding or italicized or underlying to highlight information. I mean, is color permissible at times? Potentially, but we have to be mindful of distracting from or competing with recommended information in the prescribing information. I should say that we encourage color in other types of prescription drug labeling, like instructions for use for patients. It's they can be very helpful to look at with respect to figures when using specific devices. But generally, we have to be mindful and careful of using color in the prescribing information. Thank you.
We've got just under a minute left, and we're going to try to squeeze in one more question. And here's the question. The prescribing information for an approved product should include all information for healthcare providers to ensure the safe and effective use of the product. As such, could you clarify if all appropriate instructions for the healthcare provider should be included in subsection 2, preparation administration instructions? Recently, many products have been approved with very detailed standalone instructions for use documents that would seem to be appropriate for patients and caregivers. And then what is FDA's current thinking regarding instructions for use documents for products that are administered by healthcare providers only?
So I think there's two questions there. So good, good question about distribution of information within the dosage administration section and a patient instructions for use. That's when there is a patient instructions for use for complicated or detailed dosage administration, preparation, handling instructions. So generally, the DNA section is for the healthcare practitioner, written for the learned professional, where so one may not need to include information about universal technique, about washing hands, for example, whereas instructions for use for patients and caregivers are written at or below the national reading level, which is about a sixth grade reading level in the United States. So there you want to include more details like hand washing. You may include additional figures and tables, instructions for use for patients. However, that may not be necessary in the DNA section of labeling. Sometimes there's some information that there have been medication errors about products. For example, I can recall an auto injector several years ago where patients were not getting the full dose because they were using the auto injector on their thigh and they were taking the auto injector off before the full injection was used. And a key part was to hold it there for 10 seconds after the click. Given the potential medication issue, we included that in the DNA section to notify healthcare practitioners of that. That was also very prominent in the instructions for use. So the second part of the question is our FDA's current thinking regarding healthcare practitioner IFUs. So we do have a patient IFU final guidance, which was published last year, which represents FDA's current thinking. We don't have a draft or a final healthcare practitioner IFU guidance, but that is something that we can definitely take back. Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. A huge thank you to Dr. Brodsky for your very informative and timely talk and also for responding to numerous questions that came in.